I think that the right in America has two blind spots. One is war and one is executive power. And of course, they both come together in the PATRIOT Act. The PATRIOT Act was passed during the aftermath of 9/11 and in the war on terror. And of course, we all know, I don't think the people in this room need any instruction that war is the biggest cause of big government in human history, and that includes pushing government into domestic spheres that it's not accustomed to going in. And one of them is the erosion of civil liberties. If you recall, and one of the problems I have with the ACLU is they do good work, except that they duck the war issue. It's as if, you know, the erosion of civil liberties just happens. And so I think we need to remind ourselves of that. You know, we have a history in the United States. The quasi-war with France brought the Alien and Sedition Acts. We have the Civil War, which of course Lincoln closed down newspapers, threw newspaper editors in jail, eliminated habeas corpus. Of course, World War I, we went to some of the most draconian civil liberties restrictions. People were jailed for dissent against the war and impeding the draft. And then we went to World War II, and there was some retrenchment on civil liberties violations simply because of the horror of World War I. But of course, that was small comfort to the Japanese and Japanese Americans who were rounded up and put in camp. And of course, no case of sabotage or espionage on the part of any one of those people incarcerated was ever brought. It was even accused. So then we get to the Korean War, and of course we had the McCarthy hearings as a result of that. We go to the Vietnam War, where the anti-war groups were spied upon by the Army, the FBI, and other agencies. Of course, the Cold War in general brought the national security state and the imperial presidency starting at Harry Truman. And of course, what we're going to be talking about today is the war on terror and George Bush's erosion of habeas corpus, domestic spying, torture, etc. And I think, you know, the conservatives often talk about freedom in general, but the problem is being for it in practice or in specifics. You know, when you start defending the rights of accused terrorists, the evaporation of the freedom talk goes away really fast, and I think we're only as strong freedom and liberty-wise if we can defend people accused of heinous crimes and defend their rights, because of course their rights are really our rights in the long term. Now, of course, gee, I didn't know I was going to get an applause line in my speech, but so I'll just briefly summarize what the PATRIOT Act did, and then I'll turn it over to our speakers. Of course, the Act dramatically reduced restrictions on law enforcement agencies' ability to search telephone, email, communications, medical, financial, and other records. It eased restrictions on foreign intelligence gathering within the United States, that is spying on U.S. citizens, expanded the Secretary of Treasury's authority to regulate financial transactions. And if you noticed in yesterday's New York Times, they're now using the PATRIOT Act for money laundering against alleged Hezbollah money laundering for drug purposes. Of course, the connections to the Hezbollah terrorist group itself are a little bit tenuous, but as it's mentioned deep in the article. But this is the type of thing. Also, they're broadening the discretion of law enforcement and immigration authorities in detaining and deporting immigrants suspected of terrorism-related acts. And finally, it also expanded the definition of terrorism to include domestic terrorism, of course, thus enlarging the number of activities for which the PATRIOT Act expanded law enforcement powers you can apply to all these new areas that are now called domestic terrorism. So I think with that, they're going to discuss the details of this and you know, the reauthorizations and what's going on now. And we had as was just mentioned, we've had new developments. And, you know, for once you can say maybe something positive happened on this whole front, and which was just discussed. But I'll introduce our panelists and then let them get to work. Our first speaker is going to be Jim Bovard, who is an author, a well-known author on many books on liberty. His current book is Attention Deficit Democracy. And he's also, you know, been denounced by the head of the FBI, the Secretary of Commerce, the head of DEA, the Secretary of Labor, the Postmaster General, and maybe even thrown out of a few DC bars. I don't know. But, so go ahead, Jim.
Thanks for the kind words. I appreciate that. It's, you know, it's hard for me to escape my record. You know, in giving a talk, I always like to start out by getting a better feel for the audience. So I'd like to know how many people in this room have had their phone calls wiretapped by the feds. If you could raise your hands. Well, that's the whole point. And how many people have had their email read by the National Security Agency or other federal agency? Can you raise your hands? Okay, 4. 4, and mostly on this side of the room. I'm not surprised. You know, but the paradox is we have almost no idea who's being wiretapped at this point. Well, that's not quite true. I had a few beers last week with Joe Biden, and he told me that both Ivan and Jacob have been wiretapped. Now, it turns out that the feds are having some trouble with Jacob's email because the FBI still has not learned how to translate from Spanish. This is something which was a major case in a major issue in a terrorism case in Portland back in 2004. But you know, the FBI, they're working on it. They're working on it. Now, you should keep in mind that simply by the fact that you're here in this audience today is probably going to increase the chances for you being surveilled in the future. And I'm serious on this. Next year, 2 years, 3 years down the road, you might have to, you might find yourself having to explain why you were here. You might have to be explaining that to a Secret Service agent or an FBI agent, something like that. So, you know, what you might want to do is start thinking of a good alibi. Now, something that's always worked for me when I've been put in that kind of crosshairs, I always say, you know, I just tell them, I'd heard there were going to be troublemakers there, so I figured I should go there and keep an eye on them. You know, but seriously, it's really great what Campaign for Liberty did last week, this past week, with helping shoot down John Boehner's anti-freedom joyride when he was trying to railroad through the Patriot Act extension. That was, a lot of thanks go to that, to Campaign for Liberty, and y'all deserve 3 cheers on that. I was looking at the list of the GOP members who voted against extending the Patriot Act, and I was struck. There was a huge overlap between the members that voted against that and the members who often go to Ron Paul's study meetings on Thursday at the group that hears various folks about liberty. So it's great to see that Ron Paul's efforts to work with other Republicans are bearing fruit. I've always been amazed at how much patience Congressman Paul has on that, but I guess he has a different notion of triage than what I have. Now, the topic today, the Patriot Act, this is an act which treats every American like a suspected terrorist and treats every federal agent like a proven angel. What happened was the Bush administration, after 9/11, the Bush administration carried off the biggest bait and switch in American constitutional history. The Americans were told this was going to target terrorists, but Bush and Congress awarded new powers to federal agents to use against any American suspected of violating any of the thousands of federal crimes on the books. Thanks to that, the Patriot Act is being used to target people for corruption, for obscenity, for drugs, money laundering, almost everything except jaywalking, which is not yet a federal crime. Yet, yes. RICO, there you go. And one of the most dramatic impacts of the Patriot Act was this act gave the feds the right to financially strip search you. It gave the federal agencies the right to do to your bank account what the TSA does to your body. And this is information which is being stockpiled, added to your dossiers. But with this financial information and this other information roundups, it should come with a formal warning that any information the government gathers can and will be used against you if the government decides you're an enemy. One of the hot issues this week on Capitol Hill in the Patriot Act renewal was Section 215. Now, the advocates of extending the Patriot Act talked about this, well, this is just government access to business information. You know, these folks are either idiots or they have no shame or both. Because this deals with the national security letters. And these are letters which are basically subpoenas, de facto search warrants, which can compel private citizens, businesses, nonprofits, libraries, and other entities to surrender information when a federal agent snaps his fingers. These national security letters empower the FBI to seize records that show where a person makes and spends their money, with whom he lives and lived before, how much he gambles, what he buys online, what he pawns and borrows, where he travels, how he invests, what he searches for and reads on the web, and who telephones or emails him at home or work, according to the Washington Post. Now, these national security letters, the FBI is issuing up to 50,000 of these per year. And a single national security letter can affect thousands of Americans by just, it's an incredible vacuum cleaner. And every national security letter is backed up by an FBI badge, and every badge is backed up by a gun and by the world's largest law firm, the U.S. Justice Department. National security letters have turned the Fourth Amendment on its head by creating a presumption that the government is entitled to personal or confidential information unless the citizen can afford to go to a federal judge and prove the letter should not be enforced against him. And this would easily be $10,000, $15,000, $20,000. The Founding Fathers placed the Fourth Amendment in the Constitution so the federal government would have to provide specific information that indicated criminal wrongdoing about a specific person and a specific crime. What you have with these letters is it's simply an FBI agent fills out a form and certifies that he's seeking information relevant to an authorized investigation. This is the same type of standard. This is the same kind of standard that any authoritarian government in the world could easily satisfy. It's no standard at all, and yet a lot of people in Congress want to extend that. Now, even with this broad power, the FBI wasn't satisfied and started issuing phony requests for information, claiming that a national security letter was pending before they got somebody's bank account information or their telephone records or whatever. The Inspector General for the Justice Department investigated and concluded that up almost a quarter of all these letters, tens of thousands of these letters, may have violated federal law because the FBI did not even follow the procedures. Now, let's think about this. Assume a private citizen had hacked into the FBI computer database and snared the personal data on hundreds of FBI agents. He'd be sentenced to prison for several years. Now, if a private citizen used false threats to gain other citizens' personal financial information from a bank, he'd be sent up the river for years. However, no crimes were committed when the FBI violated the law and seized citizens' personal data. Why? Because every federal violation of Americans' privacy is by definition a harmless error. This is how the feds have treated it since the start. Now, it's interesting with this push to renew the Patriot Act, people have forgotten. It happened in 2006. It was renewed. And at that point, the Bush administration kept insisting that there were no known cases that the powers had been abused. And that was part of the reason Congress rolled over. Well, it turned out that the FBI and the Justice Department knew there had been hundreds, if not thousands, of abuses, of legal violations. They simply lied through their teeth. It was a brazen lie. Top Justice Department and White House officials knew it, But after that law was extended, you know, it's important to look forward, not back. Now, it's funny, back when the Patriot Act was first railroaded through Congress in the weeks after 9/11, we were told that it was safe to vest all this power in these federal agencies because Congress would keep a close eye on how that power was used. Now, if you look at what happened since then, on the Senate side, the only senator to vote against the Patriot Act, and the guy that did heroic work trying to compel the government to disclose what rights and privacy had been violated was Russ Feingold. And Feingold was defeated last fall for re-election in part because of his standing up for civil liberties. On the Senate side, Senator Patrick Leahy has fought for some oversight, but he's been pretty much thwarted. Now, from what Matt said earlier, there's going to be another vote on the Patriot Act on Monday. I would, you know, with the procedure now, they only need 50%, so betting odds don't look good. But maybe somebody in this audience can explain to me. You have most of the GOP stampeding to make sure that federal agencies under Obama continue to have vast surveillance powers over Americans. Why? How does the GOP benefit from letting the other party spy on them? I mean, there's a long history of these abuses, yet it seems as if some congressmen are in the habit of groveling every time an FBI agent snaps his fingers. Now, part of the reason, you know, a major reason why the Patriot Act is horrible is that congressmen simply don't give a damn about federal agencies violating Americans' privacy. Just as long as federal agents are not flogging mothers on Main Street, Congress is not going to pay attention. And don't forget, if you think back 17 years, 18 years, don't forget that the first reaction after the fire of the FBI final attack at Waco, the first reaction when Janet Reno came to testify on Capitol Hill, the congressmen lined up to have their pictures taken with her. Because Janet Reno was very popular then, and that's all that mattered. So the congressmen, the senators wanted to share the glory. Now, some people might say, well, that was Waco, that was ancient history. Think about it. 5 years ago, George Bush gave his State of the Union address a few weeks after the New York Times had exposed his warrantless wiretapping of thousands of Americans. A program that was unconstitutional, illegal, and it's an outrage that Bush and others have not been indicted for it. Well, for that State of the Union address, George Bush went up to Capitol Hill, and he stood there and he bragged about his, quote, terrorist surveillance program. And almost all the Republicans gave him a standing ovation. Ron Paul did not, but, I mean, it was just, and how is it possible to know that the people who were wiretapped were actually terrorists? Well, because they were wiretapped. This is a standard of logic which they have used to expand their powers again and again. Now, the Founding Fathers intended the Congress to be a vigorous check, but some people here might think I'm being too hard on Congress, that it's important to keep in mind the things we learned in high school civics class and to have faith in the system. Now, I don't know how many of you passed through airports on your way to this conference, but we have all these TSA agents squeezing boobs and balls all over the country, and almost nobody on Capitol Hill has the gumption to stand up and raise hell. Well, some of them don't, yeah, but I mean, could you think of a more brazen assault on Americans' dignity and privacy? And there's almost no courage on Capitol Hill on this. I mean, TSA has already taken probably millions of photos of naked travelers, and at some point, these photos are going to leak out. Because let's be honest, everything the TSA does, it screws up. And so, you know, they're saying, don't worry, the government will keep it secret. Yeah, boy. So this big leak, this leak of photos is going to happen. And what will Congress do then? What Congress will probably do is give TSA a budget increase so it can get better software to avoid the problem happening again. Now, if we had a WikiLeaks for TSA, if we could see all the agency's memos, if we could see the TSA's memos, their emails, their secret directives, I suspect that support for TSA would collapse faster than the support enjoyed by an Arab dictator. But unfortunately, this is the kind of thing that Congress is supposed to do. Congress is supposed to pry this information out. Congress is supposed to beat this agency over the head. Instead, Congress grovels. And they've been groveling horribly ever since 9/11, and before, actually. Now, I've heard some politicians say that if you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear. Well, why is it that people should assume that a government that lies about spying on them is going to show good faith with the information it steals? There have been a lot of cases in recent years, bushels of cases, of prosecutors lying and sending innocent people to prison. Now, let's just say a hypothetical here. Let's say that you and a friend are exchanging email about the Oklahoma City bombing or some other atrocity, and you're totally opposed to it, but the emails go back and forth, and a prosecutor is just pulling in all those emails. Well, what that prosecutor might do would be to splice your emails, twist your sentences, and make it sound as if you're in favor of assassinating a congressman or even an assistant cabinet secretary. And once the feds have that, I mean, this is the kind of distortion that happens often with the tapes and wiretapping. The criminal defense lawyers hear the original tapes, it's like, well, that's not what we had at a trial, but this can happen with email as well. And so let's say that the feds have that, and the feds decide to drop a hammer on you and give you a choice. You have a choice of going to prison for several years based on their fabrications, or if you want to stay free, then you have to become an informant and help the government entrap your friends and colleagues. Now, I would not be surprised in the coming years if we see the same type of entrapment against the Tea Party and against pro-liberty organizations that we've seen against mosques in recent years. I mean, you have all these agents targeting people, and the challenge is to find one moron. And there's a lot of morons out there. But folks might think it's unfair to assume that, but if you look at the history of COINTELPRO, when the FBI was targeting and entrapping civil rights leaders, anti-war movement leaders, rank and file, and even feminists. This is what the government does when the government decides that some group is an enemy. And there is a risk that if the pro-freedom folks keep making progress, the feds will be able to, the feds will make more efforts to make the freedom movement look bad. Maybe that's the kindest way to say it. But the thing is that the biggest paradox about this nothing to hide notion, the politicians who invoke this are often the first to insist that Americans must be prohibited from knowing what their government is doing. So, I mean, privacy has people's right. The right to privacy has migrated from private citizens to the federal government. In the last 10 years, it's become far more difficult to find out what the FBI, what the Justice Department, what a lot of these agencies are up to. And yet, we're supposed to act like our freedoms are safe because we're still allowed to say the Pledge of Allegiance. Now, folks say, but the Patriot Act is anti-terrorist, therefore it's pro-freedom. But the only way to reconcile a law like the Patriot Act with freedom is to assume that unjustified government intrusions into people's lives are irrelevant to freedom. That, that the government has not violated anyone's rights until it secretly arrests them, strips them of their constitutional rights, and tosses them in the Gitmo or maybe Bagram. Never forget that the more information the government acquires about you, the more power the government can have over you. And this is power that will be abused again and again. The Patriot Act is symptomatic of a government out of control. Keep in mind, a democratic government that respects no limits on its power is a ticking time bomb waiting to destroy the rights it was created to protect. America needs a higher grade of patriotism. It's not patriotic to ignore violations of the Constitution. It is not patriotic to look the other way when politicians ravage rights. It's not patriotic to pretend that politicians are entitled to all the power they can grab until they're impeached or indicted. And it's not patriotic to give the benefit of the doubt to people who are trying to shackle you. Getting rid of the Patriot Act will be a small step towards making government less dangerous and making Washington less noxious. Thanks.
Okay, our second speaker is Jacob Bumper Hornberger. He's the founder and president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and his organization has just won an outstanding an award from Ron Paul's Liberty in the Media Awards for the Outstanding Freedom website, which is a really great accomplishment. So, Bumper.
One of the fascinating parts of the revolution in Egypt is the lessons that that revolution holds for us Americans. One of the most persistent and insistent demands of the demonstrators has been for the Mubarak dictatorship to lift the nation's anti-terrorism law. Now, this was a law that was enacted in the height of an emergency, the assassination of the president of the nation 30 years ago. It was a temporary measure designed to last only until national security was secured and until the war on terrorism in Egypt was resolved satisfactorily. It is this anti-terrorism legislation that enabled the Egyptian dictatorship to commit unfettered searches of people's homes and businesses in order to protect the nation from the terrorists. Warrantless searches to arrest people arbitrarily, simply on suspicion of being involved with a terrorist group, again to protect the nation and to protect the national security. To detain people in Egyptian jails indefinitely on suspicion of being a terrorist. And of course, to secure information about possible future terrorist attacks, future assassinations of government officials, through torture. Torturing these suspected terrorists to divulge that information, to protect the nation. And of course, where necessary, to engage in extrajudicial executions of people engaged in terrorism. And what's fascinating about this is that after 30 years of suffering under these powers of this anti-terrorist legislation, the Egyptian people have figured out that all this is an attribute of tyranny. And what's fascinating is at this very same time that this revolution's been taking place and this demand has been being made and is still being made to lift this anti-terrorist legislation, right here in the United States, we have the members of Congress, the President of the United States, that are doing everything they can to extend and expand the anti-terrorist legislation that came into existence in this country at the height of an emergency, the 9/11 attacks, that is only temporary until the last terrorist is killed, and it revolves around national security and designed to keep us safe from the terrorists. When the Patriot Act came into existence, this opened up the floodgates to warrantless searches and seizures. Sure, they may have their little technical requirements that, they have to have reason to believe that the person might be involved with terrorism. But for all practical purposes, they have unfettered right to go do their little sneaks and peeks, breaking into people's homes, breaking into people's business, because you know what? They know that nothing's going to happen to them if they don't follow the little technicalities. If they can get away with torture and destruction of evidence of torture, and get away with kidnapping and illegal NSA spying and illegal deals with telecoms to spy on their customers and snitch to the government, they can get away with anything. I mean, we live in the era of simply unfettered searches. We live with that cloud over our lives. You know, you've got these NSA letters where they send a letter to your bank or financial institution, no probable cause, no going before a judge and showing a reason why they need these things, just a little letter that they themselves write, say, deliver that customer's financial records to us because we suspect he might be involved with terrorism. And, oh, by the way, if you tell the customer that we've done this, we will come after you with a felony prosecution and we will put you in the jail for many, many years. And all designed to keep us safe. And then you've got that inane library requirement where they're monitoring what people are reading in order to protect us from the terrorists. And you see, it's not just the Patriot Act. I mean, we may favor the repeal, and we do favor the repeal of the Patriot Act, but that's not going to solve the problem here. That's just part of the problem. You've got to put the Patriot Act in the full mosaic of this war on terrorism legislation and processes that have come into existence since 9/11. I mean, you got to give credit where credit is due to this dictator Mubarak. At least he went to the Egyptian parliament and got this thing enacted by the parliament. George W. Bush, after 9/11, ruled by decree. He went and got his lawyers to say, you're a commander-in-chief. We're at war now. We're at war against the terrorists. You can do whatever you want. You have omnipotent powers. You want to go out and make deals with telecommunications companies that spy on Americans? You got that power. You want to search people's homes and businesses? You got that power. You want to assassinate people, including Americans? You got that power. You're a commander-in-chief. You've got that helmet on. And so they didn't even go to Congress when they developed this inane concept called the enemy combatant doctrine, which enables them to do exactly what Mubarak had the power to do, go out and pick up any American simply by targeting him and saying, you're a terrorist. And we now can put you in a military dungeon. We can whisk you to Guantanamo if we wish. We can torture you. We can isolate you. We can execute you. We can do whatever we want. Oh, by the way, we have special tribunals to handle these things, just like Mubarak's legislation had national security courts. And all of this to keep us safe, to protect us from the terrorists, the exact same justification that the Mubarak dictatorship has used for 30 years. And that's the anomaly here. You see, this crisis in Egypt has almost certainly caused inner conflict within the American people. Because here they're celebrating, they're watching people celebrate the toppling of this dictator, demanding that the first thing this military regime do is lift this anti-terrorist legislation, while Americans are over here saying, wait a minute, this anti-terrorist legislation is pro-freedom. It's pro-democracy. It's to keep us safe. Please expand it, extend it, protect us, make us safe. And it goes even deeper than that. You see, because while the world is celebrating the toppling of a dictator, U.S. officials, despite their ostensible celebration of this thing, are very conflicted. And so are a large segment of the American people. Because you see, this was our government's dictator. This was our government's torture machine. It wasn't just the tear gas canisters that were made in America. It was the instruments of torture. It was those torture rooms that were paid for with U.S. taxpayer cash in the form of foreign aid to this dictatorial regime. This was our ally. This was our friend. The Vice President, Suleiman, was our torturer. He was the guy that struck the torture rendition deal with the CIA that enabled the CIA to kidnap a man in Italy and rendition him to Egypt to get tortured so that our government could say, we are exceptional. We don't torture. it's people that torture on our behalf. And so here's the anomaly. That here these people are recognizing that anti-terror legislation is an attribute of tyranny. Over here, Americans are thinking, oh no, the Patriot Act, the enemy combatant doctrine, the power to assassinate, the power of indefinite detention, Guantanamo, this is all freedom. This is pro-freedom. And while the rest of the world celebrates the toppling of a dictator, something you'd ordinarily think is something to celebrate, large segments of American society are lamenting, are sad, including large segments of the U.S. government, over the fact that this is America's friend, our torturer, our ally. If this isn't enough to give us a danger signal in this country, I don't know what is. This is like a yellow light or a red flashing light that something's wrong in this country. This is the time for us to do some serious soul searching. Because when a large segment of your nation is lamenting the toppling of a brutal dictator, one of the most brutal in history, and celebrating and trying to expand legislation that the rest of the world is recognizing as tyranny, that's the time for soul searching. We need to be asking ourselves the same kind of questions that our American ancestors were asking in 1776. The same kind of questions they were asking in 1787. What does it mean to be free? What does it truly mean to be free? What is the role of government in a free society? And what is the duty of the citizenry when a government becomes destructive of the legitimate ends of the people? And in order to do this soul searching, we need to return to first principles. And we have this heritage of first principles when it comes to liberty. We can go back to the Declaration of Independence when Thomas Jefferson reminds us that all men, not just Americans, but Egyptian people, people all over the world are endowed with certain fundamental rights, inherent rights, God-given rights, natural rights. The right to be secure in your homes and your belongings and your papers. The right to privacy. To be able to do whatever you want in your own home as long as it's peaceful. The right to be left alone. To have some dignity as a human being without having to kowtow and lick the boots of some government official. Everybody in this room understands the importance of economic liberty, importance of the right to keep and bear arms. But what we've got to keep in mind is another principle, founding principle, that came into existence in the Constitution, the other founding document of this country. Now, we got to remember what that Constitution is. You know, people tend to think that this federal government is like God, like it's always been there. You know, in the beginning was the federal government. You know? Not so. This federal government was called into existence by the Constitution. That was the purpose of the Constitution, to call into existence the federal government. And a lot of people were leery of this thing. Americans, just people like you and me. They were very leery of this thing. And why? Because they suspected that this federal government would become like a Mubarak dictatorship or a British dictatorship, because they'd had the experience of British dictatorships. Dictatorships that were just as bad as the Mubarak dictatorship, if not worse. So they understood that the Constitution not only would bring the government into existence, but that it would be a straitjacket that would bind the government. Then the Bill of Rights brings into existence the 4th, 5th, and 6th, and 8th Amendments that protect people and their due process rights from arbitrary arrest. This is what we need to ignite in this country. That resurgence, that awakening. And we need to go to the root. It's not just enough to enshrine civil liberties, protect civil liberties. We've got to go to the root of the problem, and that's the foreign policy that produces the anger and the hatred, that brings the terrorist attack that then is used to take away our freedom. That's the support of the dictatorships. That's the invasions. That's the occupations. Like Ron Paul put it, they came over here because our government was over there doing bad things to them. We need an awakening in this country. We need an awakening that will cause the entire rest of the world to stop dead in its tracks. As the American people start to rumble and discover our heritage of liberty, we need to lead the world out of this morass. Not only with respect to economic liberty, not only with respect to the end of the drug war, not only with respect to gun rights, we need to show the world the importance of civil liberties, due process of law, the rights enshrined in the 4th, 5th, 6th, and 8th Amendments. That's where the Campaign for Liberty comes in. That's where you come in. You are the light that is shining through this darkness. And as we continue to fight against these oppressors and these deceivers and these power lusters, make no mistake about it, we will prevail over them through truth, principles, and the devotion to the heritage of what this country stood for. If we do that, the rest of the world will stop dead in its tracks and watch the American people, not the American government, the American people lead the world to the highest reaches of freedom that mankind has ever seen. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
I didn't want to seem like the movie Animal House where I tried to cut the speaker off when he was on a roll there. So, but we do have to have some time for questions, and so I guess they're going to put a microphone out here. I'll start with the first question while they're putting the microphone out. I just wanted our speakers to address, if they can briefly, how serious they think this infringement of civil liberties under the George W. Bush administration, and now I would argue that Obama hasn't made that many improvements in it. How serious is this erosion of civil liberties compared to others in American history?
Is this on? Okay, is this on now? Going once, going twice. I would say it's far worse than 90% of the other American presidents. I think George W. Bush was not as bad as Abraham Lincoln, but almost nobody is. George Bush was perhaps as bad as John Adams with the Alien and Sedition Acts. I mean, John Adams went after the specific editors and writers, but George Bush kind of cast a much wider dragnet. I mean, he didn't go after the journalists or editors in the same way, but it had much of the same effect. And there was this, I mean, what George Bush did was made very explicit that the president is above the law. It was fascinating to me in May of 2004 when the memos leaked out from the Justice Department in which the top lawyers and the Justice said that they had concluded, or perhaps they had discovered, that the criminal law and the Constitution does not apply to the president during wartime. And too bad this war on terrorists might be perpetual. But you had an explicit statement by the top people in the Justice Department that the law did not apply to the president and the Constitution did not bind him. And the roof did not fall in on Washington. I was disappointed. I was naive. But I had thought that, along with the torture scandal that erupted at that time, would cause a profound backlash. But it didn't, partly because the Democrats were cowardly on attacking that issue, but most of the GOP seem to be proud of the torture. And they've changed a bit in the last year or two, a lot of them have, but torture was a big vote getter for George Bush, I think at least in the 2006, or at least they thought it was. A lot of the messages which they used. And there's a fascinating snippet which shows how the Bush administration milked the American public. There was a study by Cornell that showed that each time that the president issued a terrorist alert, or that the U.S. government issued a terrorist attack warning, the president's approval rating rose by roughly 3%. Now, during the summer and fall of 2004, there were a lot of BS terrorist alerts. George Bush was reelected by 3% margin. So,
is there a state-by-state solution, or is this just a federal case?
Well, I mean, it'd be nice if there was a state-by-state solution, but these are federal laws. And if it's possible to have a theory that would be upheld in federal courts, that the states can nullify it, fine. But I think what fundamentally needs to happen is that Americans need to realize that the government has vastly more power over them than what they think, and the government is far more punitive than what they believe. For some reason, far too many Americans still trust the government. And why, I don't know. I've tried.
Well, and you can resist at the state and local level the militarization of the police and these fusion centers where they're working together now to, as part of the war on terrorism. That's what can be done at the state and local level.
Next question.
Hi, Dan Krause, New Jersey. Yesterday morning, there was a presentation by Republican and Democratic pollsters that showed that a vast majority of Americans felt unsecure and unsafe. Now, the overall tenor was that this is how they feel, they're way out ahead of us, the people want us to invade Iran, the people want us to, attack terrorists, and all these other things. Is there any way that you perceive to change that perception of the American people so that they understand that if we do these things, we'll only get more terrorism and more horrible laws like the Patriot Act? Is there any way to change that perception?
Well, perhaps the first thing is for Americans to understand that they've been lied into war after war after war. I mean, it was complete fraud why we went into Iraq both times. It was fraud why we went into Vietnam. Afghanistan very quickly became a fraud. And yet, for some reason, it's almost, well, people have to realize that the media and the government are hand in hand very often. And that you can't expect the mainstream media who goes to the same dinners and the same cocktail parties with these congressmen or these cabinet members to bluntly tell their readers or their listeners that the government is lying to them again and again and again. I mean, I am continually amazed how rarely the media will label a government lie a falsehood. Instead, it's kind of like, well, there's a difference of opinion. No, it's a lie.
Well, it's the power of ideas. I mean, that's what we're doing here today. You go back home and you spread these ideas. We're in a battle against the status. It's a philosophical battle. It's a moral battle. But ideas ultimately prevail, and we have good ideas. If you let people know that there is this battle between the statists that are calling for empire and interventionism and so forth, then there's those of us over here that are calling for our heritage of non-intervention and liberating the private sector. Foreigners love Americans. They just hate the U.S. government, and with right reason.
Thank you.
Okay, we only have time for one more question. I'm sorry to the other people standing in line, but this has to be the last question because we have to go to the next program.
Hey guys, I appreciate the opportunity to get to hear from y'all, and I've learned a lot. And as far as Campaign for Liberty, over the last few months I've learned a lot from just researching and just learning about what this organization is about. And for me, I want to know how I can make the biggest impact when I get back home so I don't fall on deaf ears. Like, I can talk about it, but I want to know, like, what can I do? I want to be passionate about it. I mean, I really want to move, and I want to support Ron Paul, and I want to do these things that these people want. And I love these guys. I've met a lot of you. I've met you guys. I've met Jack Hunter. There's a lot of great people in here. I want to know how to make an impact when I get back to South Carolina to support you guys, support this campaign, and to rock this nation for liberty.
Okay, any suggestions?
Yeah. Now that is one of the most popular questions I've heard in the 21 years I've been doing the Future of Freedom Foundation. You know what the answer is? You got to figure out what you're good at, what you're interested in, what you're passionate about, and then you go for it. You're the best judge of where you can do the most good for this movement. That may be writing letters to the editor. It may be running for office. It may be helping a candidate run for office. It may be talking to your neighbor. You make that call because you know what your talents and your interests and your abilities are.
And a second thing is, I think what a lot of the people in this room already have, and that's why they're here, is to have the courage to stand up to the government and say no. To stand up and tell and shout or make it known when the government is going across the line, when the government's violating the law, violating the Constitution, somebody's got to stand up and say BS. And that's one thing that's really good. I mean, there was a saying. I was trying to find a way to express this a few years ago, and people will know if America's going in the right direction if the average congressman fears a meeting with his constituents the same way the average American fears an IRS audit. chat.
Okay, I'd just like to mention one thing. There's going to be a book signing for all our books at 12:30 at the Campaign for Liberty in booth 500 through 502 in the exhibit hall. So I hope you can all come by and talk to us. We'll be happy to talk to you more as well. And please give a round of applause for Jim Bovard and Bumpy Hornberger.